Next, we're going to turn our attention to making sure you understand some of the newer features of the new software, which the USMLE calls FRED. Now, this FRED software didn't change anything at all about how the exam is scored or how you're going to be evaluated. It merely changed the interface by which you're going to interact with the exam going forward. F-R-E-D, FRED. What does that stand for? It doesn't stand for anything. Those letters are not abbreviations. It's just the code name that they used when they were developing the software. We think there's probably a FRED and a Wilma version out there. Apparently the USMLE is very much into the Flintstones. What I've done is mock up here a line drawing that shows you all the right things in all the right places. Now, I'd love to show you an actual screenshot of what you're going to see when you go into the exam, but that's copyrighted material by the USMLE, and so I'm not allowed to show you that in this context. Nonetheless, in this mock-up, we have all the right things in all the right places. I now just want to walk you through looking at some of the key features of the FRED software. First, the block begins and the screen opens up before you. Where should your eyes go first? Well, that's obvious, to the question. Everything else is a distraction. The question is your focus. Dealing with, processing, handling this question is your main job for the day. I'm going to talk about some other features of the software, but I need to emphasize at the outset, it's the question that should be your primary focus. Now, in addition to the question and the possible answer choices on the screen, let me go around the screen and talk about some other features you might find useful. First, over on the left-hand margin, there's a bar. In this bar, numbers 1 through, and if you scroll down, there will be a scroll bar there, the number of questions in the block. If there's 43, it'll be 1 to 43. If it goes up to 50, it'll be 1 to 50. This is there on the screen all the time and enables you to see where you are in the block and enables you to think about the questions presented as a block, not just as the individual question. When you answer a question, the answer that you give will show up right next to the number of that question. Now, this is a nice feature because you don't have to wonder about whether or not the computer, quote, got your answer, unquote, or not, because it'll be right there. You can literally see the computer recorded your answer. If you were to mark a question, and we'll talk about what that means in just a couple of minutes, then a small check mark appears beside your answer. This is the computer's way of recording that you want to remember, maybe come back and look at that particular question again. If you take your mouse and you click on one of the question numbers, then that question will come up and fill the screen before you. That will now be the question that you're looking at. This means it's very easy to navigate around within the block of questions. If you click on question 2 is now before you. If you click on question 10 is now before you. It's very easy to pull up just the question that you want to see, and hence a very nice feature of the software. Right above this list of numbers where your answers are recorded, there are 2 clocks, the day clock and the block clock. One of these 2 clocks is running all the time. One of these clocks, the day clock, is recording your total break time that you have remaining. The other clock, the block clock, is of course telling you how much time you have remaining to handle the block of questions in which you're currently looking. Now let's be clear, one of these clocks is running all the time. If it's not the break clock, it's the block clock. So as you're doing your questions, the seconds are ticking away. As you look at the options, the seconds are ticking away. As you're scratching your nose, the seconds are ticking away. The clock is always running. You cannot stop it. Like sands through the hourglass, so are the minutes of your exam. By which I mean to underline for you, this is not merely a multiple choice test. This is a timed test, and that changes everything. Some of you, I know, are sitting there thinking, I'm going to study, work hard, and go in and just do my best. Yeah, you don't really understand how this process works. You understand, because of the time pressure, you're essentially not allowed to do your best. When I was back in graduate school, many, many years ago now, I had to remember for one of the courses that I took, there's one and only one reason to give people a timed test. You know what it is? When you want them to feel stressed, when you want them to feel under pressure, when you want them to just not be able to do their best. Why is this a time test? Because we're guaranteeing by that the performance that you evidence will not be your best performance. You have to get your score under circumstances where it's rigged against you, because time pressure hurts your score. Most of you will walk out of the exam feeling like, if I just had more time, I'd have done better. And that's not fantasy, that's absolute fact. If we gave you more time, almost all of you would have a higher score in the exam. But you don't have more time. I can't give you more time. So you must adjust to the fact that you're under time pressure. That means concretely the following. Never do practice questions unless you have a clock running. If you're in the habit of walking around with a book of practice questions and a spare moment sitting and doing a question, please stop doing that. That's not real exam preparation. Real exam preparation is do questions in exam-like situations. You do questions in clusters and under time pressure. My recommendation, 10 questions, 10 minutes. 20 questions, 20 minutes. 30 questions, 30 minutes. You do have, roughly on average, 1 minute and 20 seconds per question, but don't practice like that. Make practice hard. If you make your practice time difficult, crank up the time pressure, you're going to find you're more able to master the time pressure issue during the real exam going forward. Always use a clock. Always do the questions in clusters because you're trying to develop the basic skill, the basic habits that you're going to need to excel and do well during the exam. USMLE Step 2 CK questions will be on average between 100 and 110 words long. That's the question stem. The question that you see before you here is frankly, by USMLE Step 2 CK standards, a very short question. I'm using a short question because I wanted to make sure it all fit on the slide. On the real exam, you may have to scroll down. There'll be a scroll bar over on the right-hand side in order to see all the question or all the options. That shouldn't be surprising. You have to deal with long questions in a limited amount of time. And getting good at just that simple process takes a bit of preparation and, frankly, a bit of practice. With that basic framing, I now want to take some time and go across the buttons at the top of the screen, help you understand what these buttons mean, what they're good for, and then make some recommendations about how you might use them during the exam itself. We first come to two fairly obvious buttons, Previous and Next. The Previous button takes you, well, back to the previous question. The Next button takes you, quite obviously, ahead to the next question. These are how you, in essence, turn the page. How you, when you've answered a question, you want to move on to the next, you simply click the Next button, and now you move on to the next question. I'd like to actually recommend you don't use these buttons, and here's why. As you're moving through your block of questions, after you've done 4, 5, 6, 8 questions, it becomes difficult to remember which question number you're on. Now, the question number is on top of the screen so you can see it, but you don't really remember exactly where you are. And so it's hard to manage your time if you don't really remember which question you're on. For this reason, I like to recommend that when you want to go forward on a question, you just take your mouse and you click on the question number over in the bar on the left-hand side. By clicking on the question number, that question, the next numbered question, will come up, and you can watch yourself move number to number through the questions in the block. This gives you much more of a sense of where you are and therefore much more control than simply clicking Next a series of times, where you tend to get lost as to where you are on the block. We come next to M, which stands for the ever-popular Mark button. This is a very handy feature of the software. When you click Mark, then the question that you're on, the one on the screen before you, gets a little check mark over in the left-hand margin. This shows the computer remembering the question for you. In other words, when you hit the Mark button, you're telling the computer, index, remember this question for me, so if I want to come back and look at it again, I have a mark that tells me that I want to come back and look at this again. So whenever you're just not quite sure what the answer is, you can dink, mark the question, and now that's indexed so you can come back to it again. And this is very handy, right? No, it's not. This is the work of the devil, ladies and gentlemen. Because, be honest, how often in your block of questions are you going to be just not quite sure what the answer is? If you're like many people, it's going to be, maybe 20 to 25 times. That means you're going to finish the block of questions with 20 marked, with the delusion that you'll get to go back and look at those 20 questions again. Given the time constraints of the exam, it simply won't happen. Your ability to go through all the questions, then go back through a bunch of questions again, is simply, at least on a probability basis, not going to occur. And so my advice for this Mark button is very straightforward. Don't use it. When you come to a question, deal with the question, give your best shot, and then move on. Don't figure you're going to come back. Figure you need to move forward. Now, having said that, I've been helping people get through the USMLE exam for a long time, and so I know none of you are going to listen to me. That mark button is just too tempting. All of you are going to use the mark button. So here's my fallback position. If you must use the mark button, limit its use. No more than 3 times in every block of questions. Save it for those questions that are very, very long. Save it for the questions where there's maybe a lot of numbers, a lot of lab values, where you know you didn't really spend the requisite time on the question and you want to go back and have a chance to look at it again. But if you're sitting on the cusp, you're not sure whether or not you ought to mark the question, the answer is no. Deal with each question as you come to it and then move forward. Don't worry about going backward. We know why you use the mark button. Use the mark button not for get me a good score reasons, but for I want to feel good reasons. Think this through with me. You read the question, you don't quite know the answer, and you feel bad. But you don't want to feel bad. And so you say to yourself, I know, click, I'll mark this and come back and get it later. And now you feel much better, don't you? Your score is bad, but you feel better. Using the mark button helps you feel better, but doesn't actually give you that exam performance improvement that you're looking for. My advice, deal with each question as you come to it, and then move on. Now, having said that, if you don't listen to that advice and you do use the mark button, please, please make sure you answer every question you also mark. Because if you mark it and don't get to go back and look at it again, any answer that you keyed will be counted. And who knows, you might have gotten lucky and just guessed the right answer. So you must make sure that any question you mark is also answered. Right next to the mark button, we have A, which stands for the ever-popular annotate button. When you click on the annotate button, a small window opens up in the middle of the question in which you can type a note to yourself, that is, annotate the question. You want to give yourself some commentary on the question, you can do so in the annotate window. I have no idea what value this is. What are you going to write for yourself about this question? This question is hard. I don't really understand what the value is here. Do you? If you need to make a problem list for yourself, if you need to do a calculation, you will be given your Prometric Center a whiteboard with a marker, and you can do that sort of in real time, not on the computer. That's what you should be using, not this annotate window. This annotate window is nothing more than a time sink. It will cost you time to open, type, write whatever note you're going to write there, and it does not give you value in terms of improving your chance of getting the question correct. Why is this annotate button part of the software? Well, we think that many, many years ago, when the exam went from being a paper and pencil exam to computerized exam, the people that produced your USMLE got a whole list of complaints from students saying, these are things I can do on paper and pencil that I can't do on a computerized exam. One of them was, I can write marginal notes. In short, I can annotate my question. And so here we are, years later, when nobody cares, with the annotate window. The advice should be fairly clear here. Don't use this. This is not going to help you. It's going to consume valuable time you need for other things. It's a feature that's available, but a feature you should frankly avoid. Next to the A, we have a button that says Lab. This is the Normal Labs button. When you click on the Normal Labs button, a window opens up at the bottom of the screen which says Normal Lab Values, and then lists 4 clusters of lab values: blood, cerebrospinal, hematological, and sweat and urine. If you click on one of those 4, you're going to get another window that opens up that shows you all the important lab values related to that topic, along with their reference range in both English and metric equivalents. So when you get laboratory values in your question, and you will get a lot of lab values in your Step 2 CK exam, you can look up to see whether or not the lab values you're given are hyper, hypo, or in the normal range, as specified here by what they're giving you on the exam. This is a nice, handy feature to have in the software. And once again, it's a feature you should not use. Why? Just think with me for a second how long it's going to take you to look up all the lab values in a question that gives you maybe 4 or 5 different lab values. By the time you click and open, click for the subheading, click and find the value you want, close that, go and find the next value you want, close that, go and find the next value you want. Just think for a second how much time that's going to take, and then reflect on how many questions you're not going to get to, and therefore get no point for, because you were spending all your time looking up the normal labs. Why don't you use the normal labs button? Ladies and gentlemen, you're supposed to know these already. This is core information for physicians. And if you don't know your normal lab values, put it on your to-do list in terms of your preparation for the exam. My suggestion is to get the printout of these normal labs. You can get that at the USMLE website, and then spend 5 minutes a day, every day, until you have these numbers cold. And I mean cold. Not so you sit there and you think for a moment and the number comes to you. I mean, you see the number and you know immediately the meaning of the number. This is core physician information. The average person on the street sees a number, and to them it's just a number. What makes you a physician is you see the number and it carries real meaning. It has real implication, and you recognize the implications at once. Now, if you're in the middle of the exam, if you did study all your lab values, you know them, but because of anxiety or just a senior moment, you can't remember the lab values, well then this is here as a safety net. And if you really need to use the safety net, then please go ahead and use it. But don't plan to use the safety net. Plan that you won't have to use the normal lab button. You should know these values already. The last button we come to in the series is really the only button across the top that I want you to spend any time with. All the other buttons, if you've been following me, the advice is don't use this one, don't use this one, don't use this one. The one I do think that you might find some value in is the Highlight Strikeout button. Highlight Strikeout is a nice feature of the software. Works like this. If Highlight is engaged, then you take your mouse, you click and drag it across a set of words in the question stem, and those words will stay highlighted in yellow. If you click again, then they'll just stay highlighted, and you can go down and highlight different sets of words as you're reading down through the long presented clinical case. Just like you have a colored marker, a highlighter, or just like you're underlining with a pencil if you're doing this by paper and pencil. If Strikeout is engaged, well, you can take your mouse and click on an option, and that option will now go grayscale. It will still be there before you, but it'll be in faded gray text instead of in the bold or black text, which is typically how the questions are presented. Kaplan QBank has been converted to a Fred-like interface. In Kaplan QBank, you don't get the fading to gray. You actually get a line striking out the option, which is mirroring what we mean by strikeout. Highlight and strikeout can, for some people, be very nice features of the software. As we've tested this with students over the years, we've discovered that about 70% of students benefit from using Highlight and Strikeout. Highlight helps pull you into the question, focus on the content, and think more clearly. Strikeout helps you think more efficiently and not go back and reread options that you've already discarded. But for the other 30% of you, Highlight and Strikeout hurt your exam performance. Some of you, when we start to use the highlight feature, get so caught up in the mechanics of highlight that it causes you to get more focused on the mechanics than on the content of the question before you. The same thing occurs with the strikeout. Some of you think this is so neat and get so caught up in the mechanics of it that you lose focus on what your actual job is in terms of making the decision. And so on your to-do list before the exam, you have now one additional thing. You want to sit down and make sure you've used software with highlight and strikeout features so you can get a sense of whether or not this is for you or not. Now, Kaplan QBank gives you this experience, but if you don't want to do that, you can go and download a version of the software from the USMLE that will let you get a sense of how this process works. If you're not sure whether or not highlight and strikeout are for you, my advice, as always, is for simplicity. That is, if you're not sure whether it's going to help you, then leave it aside and focus just by yourself on the main event, namely the question. If it helps you, that's wonderful. Please use it. If it doesn't help you, make the appropriate choice. And make the choice that works for you. If you have a friend or a colleague who says it helps them a lot, then let them use it. If it doesn't work for you, then you shouldn't use this. We spent time talking about all the features around the edge of the screen. All of these things are in the periphery of the screen because they are peripheral. And I want to remind you again about the most important thing on the screen before you. It is, of course, the question. The question is everything. Dealing with this question correctly and effectively is your main job for the day. Let's talk a little bit about how you should deal with and how you should process this question. Now, the question I'm presenting here is, you may recall, a little bit shorter than what I told you the question length was on the usual USMLE Step 2 CK. I wanted to make sure I got a question that fit onto the screen. But questions on USMLE Step 2 CK can be very long, again 100 to 110 words in the STEM alone. So how are you going to read and process the information? Because it turns out that once the question gets to be a little bit longer than 2 sentences, your ability to read all the way through the question, grab the information you need, and then come up with the best answer is much reduced. You literally forget a lot of the information that you need. The best way I can train you to do these questions properly, that is, most efficiently and effectively, is to begin with a question and a piece of paper. And we're going to put the piece of paper over the options. All you see is the question, because your focus should be on the question. People that tell you to look at the options first, please don't. That's wrong. That hurts you. It's a misleading strategy. All the information you need to answer the question is in the question stem. And so it's the question stem that should be your primary and at the outset exclusive focus. You need to go through the question stem, grab the clues, the information you need in order to come up with the best possible answer to the question that is posed. Now there's 2 ways to read and process this question stem. The simplest is the most obvious. You read the first sentence, the second sentence, the third sentence, the fourth sentence, and you work your way all the way down through the question stem. The other way is to read the last line, that is the question line first, and thus armed, work your way down through the presented case, that is the rest of the question stem. It turns out it doesn't matter which of these strategies you use. They're both equivalent, and they both give you about the same probability of getting the question correct. Some people prefer one, some people prefer the other, and that's fine with me. It doesn't seem to matter which one you choose. But now, I need to choose one or the other, because we want to train you to do the exact same thing on every question. Not something one way on one question, something different on the next question, but every question should be done exactly by the same process so you can get that process efficient, routine, and habitual. That lets you focus on the content so you don't have to keep focus on what your process is on the question. My preferred strategy is to have you read the first sentence, the second sentence, and third sentence and work your way down through the question stem. Because although reading the question line and then going back and reading down through the stem can work just fine, there is a danger inherent in that. The danger is that you read the last line, the question line, not to set up reading down through the question stem, but to hope you don't have to read the question stem. Folks, you have to read the question. There's no way you're going to collect the clues you need in order to answer the question unless you actually read the presented information. Each USMLE question is, in short, a mini mystery story. Your job is to grab the clues and say whodunit. You can't say whodunit without the clues. You must read and process the question. Now, while you're reading the question, you must also get the meaning out of what you're reading. Think about maybe some of your own experiences during practice questions, where you read down through a long clinical case, you get to the bottom and you say, what did I just read? Or I don't remember the key things in what I just read. People often, especially under time pressure, read the words but fail to extract the meaning, the significance out of what they've read. That step is critical to making sure you have what you need mentally to answer the question. And so what we need you to do is get the meaning, not just read the words. The simplest way to get you to do that is to stop at every period and give yourself a quick mental summary of what's going on, a quick synopsis, a paraphrase of what it is that you just read. Then you read the next sentence, stop at the period, give yourself a quick summary. Then you stop at the next sentence and give yourself a quick summary. What happens with that strategy is you begin to accumulate the ideas you need as you're moving down through the case. By the time you get to the question line, you now have in mind all the information you need in order to derive a correct answer. Remember, once the question gets over 2 sentences, your ability to read and retain everything drops off dramatically. So if your strategy is to read quickly through everything, get to the bottom and say, okay, now what's going on here? It's already too late. You've literally forgotten half of what you've read. Therefore, it's not about reading and then stopping to think. It's about thinking while you're reading. Stopping at every period may sound mechanical, but it is the effective way to make sure you grab the meaning out of the question. Once you've read down through, now you answer the question. Notice the piece of paper is still over the options. The first thing you do to answer the question correctly is come up with an answer without engaging the options. Now, in case it's not clear, I'm working hard to get you to understand that the question stem is the key element, the key stimulus on the exam. The options are merely where you record the answer. We're working hard to change what is often bad multiple choice question answering behavior. Most people love to get to the options. Most people love to spend their time thinking through the options, but folks, the options will not help you. Let's say this as clearly as I can. The question stem is your friend. The options are the enemy. The question stem must, by rule, give you all the clues you need to come up with the right answer. The options are there to fool you, fake you out, to con you into picking the wrong choice. The options are not your friend. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. They're trying to present themselves as if they're something that they are not to fool you so you pick the wrong answer. If you have thought through and come up with an answer before you get to the options, you're much more willing to see through the disguise and see correctly what the best answer is. Once you've made the determination about what a good answer is, then we move the paper. Now, the options are revealed and the question stem is hidden. This is actually the most important part of this process I'm trying to teach you. See, the number one wrong behavior people do in answering these long multiple choice questions is they go back and they reread the question. By putting the piece of paper over the question stem, you cannot go back, you cannot reread. If you didn't get what you needed the first time through, tough. Now you must simply pick an answer. When the options are revealed, you have not come to the hard part of the question, you've come to the easy part of the question. All you have to do now is simply pick an option. What you can't do is go back. What you can't do is go back and check a fact, a word. Don't go back. Why? Well, we've discovered something simple but important over the years. If I put a question up on the screen and I tell you I'm going to leave the question on the screen, you read it differently than if you think I'm going to take the question away. If you think I'm going to take the question away, you read with more attention, you get more detail, and you have more retention of the details than if you think the question's simply going to be there. Then you can go back and double check yourself. The purpose of moving the paper up to take the question away is to force you to read the question the way you must. When you first start using this piece of paper technique, you probably won't like it. You probably will have the feeling that you just want to go back and check a don't let yourself go back and check. Because if you don't let yourself go back and check, you'll train yourself that you have to get it the first time. And once you know you have to get it the first time, you'll begin to read and grab what you need. If you know you can't go back, you'll start handling it as if you can't go back. This piece of paper is the simplest tool I can give you to learn to do the right question answering behaviors. Now, so I'm very clear. This piece of paper behavior I'm suggesting is a training strategy. I don't want you there in the real exam going up and down on your screen with a piece of paper. This is simply a way you train yourself to do the right behaviors, and then once you have those behaviors ingrained and habitual, you won't need the crutch of the paper any longer. As I've been working with students over the years, I made for myself an informal list of 8 things that people most often do wrong as they're handling these long USMLE type multiple choice questions. 8 common mistakes that people make in reading, processing, and understanding of the question. 8 things that people do where they get the question wrong even though they actually know the content. What I want to do next with you is go through what those 8 mistakes are and then suggest simple solutions for each one of them. At the end of this process, I'd like you to have a simple step-by-step, 8-step process for reading, processing, and answering every USMLE question that you might encounter. Now, this is a simple, concrete 8 steps. The reason for these, again, is they address problems that I've seen people have in the past. If you decide you don't have this problem, you want to omit one of the steps, that's fine. You can have whatever process you want, but I do insist that you have a standard process. I want you to have a standard habitual way of doing a question, so again, the process is now secondary and you can focus on the content. The first mistake that people make in processing and answering these long multiple choice questions is they simply fail to read the question. They simply don't read the question stem. As I read internet chat rooms, as I talk to students over the years, there's all sorts of conversation about tricks and gimmicks so you don't have to read the question. Ladies and gentlemen, the hard reality is you have to read the question. There is no replacement for that. You simply must read the question. If you don't get the clues the question provides, you simply have no ammunition to hit the target, that is to come up with the right answer. But reading the question by itself is not enough. In addition to reading the question, you have to understand the meaning of what you're reading. Simply saying the words is not nearly as important as getting the implication, understanding the meaning. When I suggested before you stop at every period, summarize and paraphrase, this is what we have in mind. This is how you squeeze out the meaning, the juice, the importance of each thing that you read. But it's not enough just to think about and understand the meaning. See, USMLE questions contain a lot of information. All the information presented is important, but some information is more important than others. The third step in the process is therefore to make a simple decision about the order of importance. What matters most? Often in step 2, CK questions, you'll be presented not with a single issue, but maybe several issues. You're going to have to decide which one merits your attention. You're going to be presented with several different reasonable course of action. You're going to have to decide which one is the current thing that requires your focus. Order of importance is a critical third step, and this is actually a big deal. I've discovered that if I sit with someone doing questions with them, and after they read the question, if I ask, what's the most important thing presented in this question? If they can answer that question correctly, their odds of getting that question correct are very, very good. And if you can't answer that question, or you tell me about 3, 4, 5 things in the question stem, your chance of getting the question correct goes down rather noticeably. The third crucial step then is to make a decision about what matters most, order of importance. The fourth step is to note the actual question. One of the most common mistakes people make on these questions is they answer the question they wanted instead of the question they got. It is critical that the answer you choose is a direct response to the actual question they gave you, not what you thought they were going to ask, what they actually asked. If you're going to reread any part of the question stem twice, it's that last line, the question line, that's worthy of that double attention. You must focus, and indeed obsessively focus, on what exactly it was they asked you. In medical school exams, anticipating what the question is going to be is actually fairly good and useful strategy. Because in medical school exams, the people writing the questions are the people who lectured to you, not for USMLE questions. The USMLE Step 2 CK questions will ask you things you don't anticipate. They will surprise you sometimes with the questions that they ask. Some question writers have told me they love to ask you the question you weren't looking for. Well, your job is to take the question they threw at you and handle that. Not bemoan the fact you didn't get what you wanted, but handle what you did get. Of all these 8 steps, the 2 that I find most often trip up students are the 2 we've just talked about. They fail to recognize what's most important, order of importance, or they fail to directly answer the question that's asked. Step number 5. After you've read the stem, after you've made decisions about order of importance and looked at the question, you have to then take that moment of thought. You have to take a moment to compare what you've read with what you know. See, putting together information from what you've studied with what's presented in the question is another core process to getting the question correct. So you must have not minutes, but seconds of reflection that give you a sense of what other content you know that's relevant, what other things could you think of that are pertinent to coming up with an answer for this question. And then you answer the question. Step 6 is anticipate the answer. As I suggested, with the piece of paper covering the options, you will now think of what makes a good answer. You're going to come up, as if there are no options presented, with what you think is a reasonable choice. I just want to pause here for a second. I told you there were 8 steps, and I've just been through 6. And you notice we haven't yet talked about the options. And that's actually intentional, because the right framework for handling these questions is 75% of your time on questions should be spent on the question stem, and 25% should be spent on the options. Out of 8 steps, the first 6 focus on the question stem, which is the key, which is what you must focus on to get your high probability of getting the question correct. Now that we've thought about a good answer, now and only now do we go to the options. And we first look at the options. Frankly, look at all the options. It's not enough just to look at some of them, because your job in the exam is not to come up with a good answer, it's to come up with the best answer. You must look through all the options presented and mark what you think is the best of all the choices that are available. Keep in mind that often on these questions, the choice that you know is the absolute best choice will not be there. They purposely took it out. What you're going to have to do then is choose the best from the options presented, even though it may not be the best answer you yourself can think of. After you look at all the options, you will then make your choice and lock it in place. The last step here is to lock in your answer. And L for lock is because once you make your choice, you shouldn't be changing your choice. We already talked about the dangers of changing the answer. We want to make sure that you have, as part of your process, making a choice and then moving on. So those are the 8 steps. 8 simple steps for handling, processing the multiple choice questions that you're going to see on your USMLE Step 2 CK exam. But there's a problem here, right? I gave you 8 steps, and remembering 8 steps is kind of difficult. So I have a simple way to try to help you remember. We're going to give you a mnemonic. Mnemonic that uses the first letter of each of these, so you now have the simple phrase, are you on call? Are you on call is the simple 8-step procedure for handling your multiple choice questions. What I have in mind, what I'd like you to do, is get in the habit of doing these 8 steps routinely, mechanically, and then going on to the next question. Done that way, you're giving yourself, we believe, the optimum process for applying the knowledge that you have. We're not guaranteeing that you're going to get the question correct. Sometimes, even with a good process, you miss something, or sometimes you simply lack a knowledge point that you need to solve the presented problem. But this is the way to guarantee that you're most likely to be able to show what you know in the exam. As always, if you don't like my process, that's fine with me, but you have to have one yourself. You have to have a clear practice process in order to be able to do your best as you encounter each exam question. You see, USMLE questions are not like other multiple choice questions you might have encountered. Many exams in medical school, it's about learning content and then spitting back what it is that you learned. But I want you to think about USMLE Step 2 CK questions a little bit more complexly. These questions are really about combining 2 sources of information. Information source 1, the information in your head. This is what you're gaining as you study. This is what you're gaining as you listen to lectures. This is what you're gaining as you do your preparation for the exam. That's one core set of knowledge. But you need a second set of knowledge if you're going to get the question right, namely the information presented in the question. Your basic process must be to combine these 2 information sources, go through the options presented, and the combination of these 2 sources will kick out what is the best possible answer. I want you to keep this template in mind when you do practice questions, because this is also a diagnostic template as to why you got a practice question wrong. You got a practice question wrong, you got it wrong for one of 2 reasons. Reason 1, you didn't know the knowledge. Reason 2, you didn't get the question. That is, there was information, clues available in the question stem, and for some reason, you didn't grab, focus, or understand the clues. Why is this diagnostic important? Simple. If you do a practice question and you get it wrong, you have to decide what to do to correct that problem, because getting a question wrong has indicated you have something that needs fixed. If you got a question wrong because you didn't know the content, well then clearly, you simply go back to your study material, learn the content, so you'll have it for a future question. But if you didn't get a question wrong because you didn't get the question, no amount of content study is going to solve that for you. You must get a sense of what you did, why you missed, what was the key thing that you didn't get out of the question that you should have gotten out of the question. Over the course of doing practice questions, you will notice patterns. You'll notice, each of you, different things, but you'll notice certain things you don't focus on, you miss, you leave out, and those are key issues for you that must be addressed before you go in to take the exam when it really counts. Some simple problems we see people have. You read keywords backwards. You read increase as decrease. You read up as down, in short. Or you skip over numbers. Lab values don't gain your attention. Or you see a drug or you see an enzyme and you think about a different drug or enzyme. That is, you don't read clearly and correctly what it is they presented to you. There are 100 other minor problems, all of which have not a minor but a major impact on your score. You need to have a clear sense about what these are and fix them prior to going into the exam. Now, if you can't quite nail down, can't quite figure out what your process problems are, I have an exercise to suggest. Students have told me this has been very useful. Pick up 100 practice questions, questions you've never done before in mixed subjects. Sit down with a clock and answer this 100 practice questions with the restriction that you get 1 minute for each question. So you must answer all 100 questions in 100 minutes. 100 questions and 100 minutes. Then put those answers aside. Don't look at them, don't score it, simply set those answers aside. Now, take the same set of questions you just did, the 100 questions, and now with no clock, go back and do the 100 questions a second time. This second time, once again, take all the time that you want. You want to take 2, 3, 5, 10 minutes per question? That's fine. Take as much time as you want. Once you've answered the questions a second time without the time pressure, I now want you to score both sets of answers, the ones under time pressure and the ones not under time pressure. You'll almost certainly discover you got more correct without the time pressure than you got correct with the time pressure. What I want you to do is focus on the questions that you got wrong under time pressure but right without the time pressure. Those are your critical process mistakes. If you got them right without the time pressure, it can't be a content issue. You clearly have the content. You got it right. It must be a process issue. When you did the question under the constraint of time, you didn't grab the information you needed to get the question right. As you do this, you will notice one or several things. You'll notice patterns, places where you should have gotten the question right but you did not, and once armed with this knowledge, you're now equipped to fix it, to make sure you change your process so it does not harm you during the real exam. Next, I want to make sure you understand what makes a good USMLE question. I want you to make sure you understand how USMLE questions are different than other kinds of questions you might see in other medical exams. Here we have before you on the screen a simple schematic of the kind of question we see in most medical schools all across the United States. Indeed, what I've seen all around the world. It's a simple paired association. Given X in the question stem, you know D in the answers. You know these two things go together, this goes with this, and so you mark the answer. This is absolutely, fundamentally not a USMLE question. This question is much too simplistic. It simply requires you pairing two simple things together and then you're done. It's not considered worthy of the USMLE, certainly of the Step 2 CK exam. Instead, what you're going to see on USMLE Step 2 CK is one of two patterns. You're going to see, most commonly, the so-called double jump or two-step item. Double jump or two-step item begins by giving you information in the question stem, and then you have a set of answer choices. But you are going to have to make a bridge from what's presented to what the answer choices are. The lines and numbers here represent that mental bridge you have to build to get you from the given information in the stem to the answer choices. The USMLE is concerned not about testing your content knowledge, at least not per se. What they're really concerned about is testing your thought process. People from the USMLE have told me, we don't really have to test your knowledge. Why? Because your medical school is already certified, you have the knowledge. What they're concerned with is, can you think with the knowledge the way a doctor needs to think? It's not about having the knowledge, or it's not just about having the knowledge. Knowledge is the prerequisite for the thought process you're actually being tested on. The rule for these double jump or two-step items is fairly straightforward. Simply, it should be a series of decisions required to move you from the question stem to the answer. Each decision should be easy. What makes the question hard is that you have to make a series of decisions correctly. Concretely, we might give you a question stem that presents you with a patient with a particular diagnosis, but we don't ask you the patient's diagnosis. Instead, we might ask you a question like, how would you talk to the patient's family about the side effects of the treatment this patient is most likely to receive? You're going to have to build the bridge from the knowledge presented in the case, what the diagnosis is, to how you're going to talk to the family about the side effects. Think about it by the simple set of decisions. You're first going to have to decide what the diagnosis is, then you're going to decide what the treatment is, then you're going to have to decide what the side effects are, and then finally, what's the appropriate way to present and talk about those side effects. 4 decisions will carry you through to the answer. These questions are straightforward in the sense that you can actually diagram them mathematically in terms of probabilities. Once again, remember the rule is each decision should be easy. What makes the question hard is the sequence of decisions. So, if I give this particular case to 100 students, 90% can tell me what the right diagnosis is. If I tell 100 students the diagnosis, 80% can tell me what the right treatment is. If I tell 100 students the right treatment, 80% may be able to tell me what the side effects of the treatment is, and so on and so forth. Each step is high probability. Each step you have a great chance of getting right, but multiplied together, joint probability of independent events being what they are, this is a question that fewer than 60% of the test takers will get correct. Now look again, because that's the core backbone logic of the USMLE Step 2 CK exam. It's not about making one decision, it's about making a series of decisions. Please note, if you make 2 decisions correctly and you miss one decision, you get 0. There's no partial credit here, it's all or none. We're not testing your knowledge per se, we're testing if you can string the knowledge together by making the right series of decisions to apply that knowledge to the problem that's presented. I call this internal medicine logic because this is how the best internal medicine physicians that I've encountered think. They're able to take the information presented and reason to a remote but crucial conclusion. They build the bridge from what is known to what must be done. The other kind of question that you're going to encounter is what we call the long clinical case items. The long clinical case items are recognizable by most students because they're, well, frankly long. But I need you to understand it's not just a lot of words on the screen before you. We're going to try to get you to understand the structure and the organization of the information in these clinical cases. So let's talk to you about this in terms of how you might write a long clinical case item. You begin by writing a clinical case. You begin by writing essentially a textbook case that includes all the classic signs and symptoms and epidemiology for this particular case that you're looking at. The X's represent all the classic signs and symptoms. What you're doing here is opening Harrison's or Robbins and just copying out the classic signs and symptoms. They're all there. It's a classic presentation. Then you have to decide on a set of options. The question writer usually, from their experience with students, has a sense of, first, what the right answer is, of course, but also a sense of how students want to get this question wrong. And so the options presented are common ways that students get the question wrong, along with the actual correct answer. We know the correct answer is D, just being consistent with the schematic I've been talking you through. Now, we haven't written the question yet. We've just laid the foundation for the question. In order to make this question USMLE worthy, we must next write a good setup. The setup is the lead-in sentence that frames everything that comes after it in the case. The setup is a sentence that tells you the patient's age, gender, ethnicity, some recent pertinent information in terms of travel perhaps, job status, or the kind of job in which they work. This is critical setup information. It frames everything that comes afterwards, and if you miss the key epidemiology presented in this setup, you miss some key clues to answering the question. We're then going to write a question about the case. Now, usually, I have to confess, we don't write a question about the case, we write a series of questions about the case. We may have a clinical case presented, and we might write a question about diagnosis, a question about treatment, a question about management. On your exam, you'll only get the case and one of those questions, because you don't get sequenced questions on the exam. You only get one question per case. But it also means in the question pool, they might have the case and then different questions about the case. So one student might get the case and get the diagnosis question. Another student might get the case and get the treatment question. Another student might get the case and get the management question. So some of you might get the exact same case, but a different question about the case. The question is not yet quite USMLE worthy. See, one of the things we know is that students often learn incompletely. They learn one thing to look for to make a diagnosis. So for example, you're going to diagnose schizophrenia, you look for, come on, auditory hallucinations. You're going to diagnose lupus, you look for the butterfly rash. Well, they don't want you to get the question right just because you remember that one clue. They want to make sure you have a sense of the total set of diagnostic criterion. So a good question writer will target one of the crucial clues, like the one of these X's over on the left here, and then just simply take it out. Now it's simply no longer there. Now the answer is the same, the diagnosis is the same, but that classic clue you might be hoping for is simply removed. Wait, we're not quite done yet. We know the thing students least like to do, especially with these longer clinical case questions, is read the question. If you watch most students when they're answering these long questions, most students don't read the whole question. They read some of it, but not all. Often students will read about maybe halfway down and then, in essence, say, I got enough, and then hop down and try to answer the question. So a really good question writer will make sure that there's some key, even crucial information in the last third of the question stem. And we tell people writing questions, don't worry if you think that gives it away. Half the people will never even read that. Now look before you. That's the structure of a good USMLE question. Notice that we build it up from scratch to give you a sense of the process, and notice what the issue is here. These aren't simply words on the page, they're words constructed into the stem a certain way. And the issue is, if you're trying to short-circuit the process, look for a single clue. Either you'll pick up a red herring or the clue you're looking for won't be there. You're trying not to read the whole stem, you'll miss some of the key information that's presented. The whole point to this is to see whether you can, in fact, read, process, and think through the presented information. And the question is constructed so attempts to short-circuit that process will very likely lead you astray. If these double jump questions, if these long clinical case questions seem to be new to you, if the processes I've talked about of thinking through the questions seem new to you, that's what your preparation and practice are about. Remember, it's not enough to simply learn the content. You have to, once again, be able to show that content in the context of the exam. Now, folks, learning to do that simply takes practice. No one is born with an innate ability to handle these kind of multiple choice questions. Dealing with multiple choice exams is not a genetic endowment, it's entirely learned behavior. One of your jobs in your preparation is to learn the content, yes, but also to master these processes so you can demonstrate what it is that you've learned. The key exam rule I've been trying to talk about here, just so we're clear, is therefore simple. 3 correct decisions gets you 1 answer correct. 3 correct decisions gets you 1 point. Notice 2 correct decisions gets you nothing. The USMLE is not checking your knowledge per se, they're checking your ability to use that knowledge, either as linear reasoning, as we did in the double jump questions, or in terms of collecting the puzzle pieces and assembling them to the appropriate conclusion, as we did in the long clinical case items. It's not about making one decision, it's about making a series of decisions to get the question correct. Now that you have a sense of the questions, I want to begin to talk to you about preparing for the exam and making sure your preparation is targeted to what it needs to be. Turns out, as we look at what are the variables affecting exam performance, about 60 to 70% of your score on the exam is due to your knowledge base. You have to know the basic content. Anyone that tells you that you can do well in the exam without knowing the basic details, concepts, ideas, simply doesn't know what they're talking about. When I've talked to you about the process issues, I'm always assuming that this content base is in place. But if all you have is the content, that's not enough. Another 25 to 30% of your score on the exam is a result of the test-taking issues, some of which we've been talking about, and I'm going to talk about some more a little bit later in terms of how you study and prepare for the exam. These are the crucial variables that help determine whether or not you know it or you're actually going to benefit and get the score that demonstrates that knowledge. Final 10 to 15% of what you do on the exam is due to, well, so-called personal issues. These are things that can affect your exam performance a lot on an individual basis, but in aggregate across a group of students don't really have that much of a dominant impact. We're talking about things here like test anxiety. Not a problem for most people, but can be a real problem if that happens to be the issue for you. We're talking about what happened in your life outside of study, outside of the exam, before you went in to take the exam. Again, this can really impact your score by distracting you, causing you to be upset, but for most people, they're not really the core issue. What I want to really do with you for the next section we have together is talk a little bit about how to get those test-taking skills and your preparation skills up to where they need to be. First, I want to emphasize that the USMLE Step 2 CK exam is different than medical practice. If you've had clinical experience, you will find it very helpful in terms of borrowing those thought processes to use on your Step 2 CK exam, but there are some crucial differences you must be aware of. First, on the Step 2 CK exam, there's only one best answer, and that's not the way real life is. In most clinical situations, there are maybe multiple drugs, all of which would be acceptable. There are multiple things you could say to the patient, all which would be acceptable. There are multiple ways you could do certain procedures, all of which would be acceptable. Yet not on the Step 2 CK. Your job is not to find an acceptable answer, but the absolute best answer. And keep in mind, you don't get to say what's best. I don't get to say what's best. The people that write the question get to say what's best. Your job in your preparation is to develop a clear sense about what they will consider to be the best answer. Second, the exam is not about reality. The exam takes place in an idealized world where idealized physicians make idealized decisions. Therefore, it's not your job to give answers based on what you've seen in the real world. It's your job to give the answer you should have seen in the real world. Students sometimes are frustrated by this because they read a question and they say, well, everybody I know does answer D, but I have to ask you to stop and consider, everything taken into account, is answer D really the best answer? The exam is about what the ideal physician should do. It's not asking you to report on what your experience has been in the real world. Third, and one of the big ways the exam is different, is your level of certainty. How sure do you want to be in medical practice? How certain do you want to be before you chart that note, write that prescription, schedule that surgery? What do you think, 80%? 90%? No, come on. You want to be as close to 100% as possible, right? And by the way, if it's me, go for the 100%. Because life and death are hanging in the balance here. You make a wrong decision, you could frankly kill the patient, or at least you could cause avoidable pain and suffering. In the real world, you want to be sure. The more certainty, the better. Not on your Step 2 CK exam. Your Step 2 CK exam, you're going to make decisions not when you're 90% sure, not when you're 99% sure, when you're 51% sure. What's 51% sure feel like? I think maybe it's D, but I'm not. Stop. It's D. Mark your answer and get out. Your decision criterion is different here. The level of certainty will be different. Why is the level of certainty different? Why a different decision? Because the consequences of your decision is different. If you make a bad decision in medical practice, you might have killed the patient. If you make a bad decision on the exam, you got a question wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to get questions wrong. Your job is to make the decision, move on, and get on with it. You don't have time to come to that level of certainty. You don't have time for that feeling of confidence that you'd love to have where you're sure what the answer is to well up within inside you. See, we find when you make decisions, you spend two amounts of time making the decision. One part is actually making the decision, processing and deciding. A second part of the time you spend feeling good, getting comfortable about your decision. I need you to work and train yourself not to worry about feeling good, but to make the decision, mark it, and move on to the next question. Some final orienting points to have you remember to give you context as you're thinking about preparing for your Step 2 CK exam. I mentioned that there were 370 questions on the exam, which is true. You get them in blocks of between 43 and 50 questions per block, but you should be aware that not all the questions on the exam count. Every exam contains questions which the examiners call field test questions. Field test questions are questions that they're trying out, giving a trial run, if you will, to see how they work before they're included on the exam where they'll count and actually influence your score. The key thing to remember is if you get a field test question right, it doesn't help you. If you get a field test question wrong, it doesn't hurt you. These questions are shuffled through the exam and they're not marked in any special way. So you don't know what's a field test question and what's not. The good news, though, is not every question counts. So if you're sitting there agonizing, not sure what the answer is to a given question, relax. Maybe it doesn't even count. The bad news? Yeah, you don't know which question counts and which one don't, so you have to answer every question like your score depends on it. Second, this is a primary care exam. The USMLE Step 2 CK exam is about primary care medicine. Even the surgery, even the OBGYN you'll see will be primary care surgery and primary care OBGYN. The surgery questions are not about the intricacies of technique, they're about patient management, what you might do before or after as the process goes forward. I need you to keep in mind always that this is a primary care exam, and here's when it matters most. Some of you have been trained in so-called procedure-based specialties, radiology, surgery, for example, and the way you think in those specialties is not the way we think in primary care medicine. You're going to have to learn to set aside those ways of thinking and adopt the ways of thinking of primary care medicine. In this way, your faculty instructors are absolutely critical for you. You should be listening as they're teaching you, not just to the content, but to the perspective they have. They're just not going to tell you what the right answers are. They're going to tell you how to look at things in order to see what the right answers are. Third, the key mental skill is to be able to recognize and differentiate, not to simply make a list. If you can come up with a list for differential, that's an important step in the process, but you must be able to recognize in the pattern of what's presented what the best answer is going forward. No one's going to ask you to talk about things. People are going to ask you to choose from the answers that are provided. And lastly, the key question on the Step 2 CK exam is not what's the answer, it's what should the physician do or say next. The key issue here is not about knowledge, it's about action. The people that put together the USMLE exam have decided many years ago that medicine is not knowledge for knowledge's sake, it's knowledge for action's sake. And your job is to drill down so you have a sense of what the correct action is. Knowing what to do in general is not good enough. Knowing the specific steps to take is the essence of medical practice.